On a grey morning in 1975, off the little town of Leigh on New Zealand's northeast coast, one man stood on the rocks at Goat Island and watched the last fishing boat pull away from 5 kilometers of reef that had been picked down to bare grey stone for 20 years. And what the emptied sea did next, in that dead zone, is something marine scientists still argue about today. Before we go any further, these ocean comeback stories are the whole channel, so hit subscribe and stay with me. Not one hook, one net, one kina bag allowed inside that line. Kina being the Maori word for the sea urchin. The whole coast sealed off in a single stroke, and almost everyone who mattered called it a waste, because that reef, they all agreed, wasn't worth saving. It was dead. Picture the reef you'd snorkel over on a summer holiday. The color, the flick of small fish, the weeds swaying in the surge. Now strip it all down to bare grey stone. No color, no movement. That's what this was. A desert of cold rock under the waves, wall to wall with sea urchins, black and spined, mowing everything flat. Divers who went down there came back up with the same word. Barren. It looked permanent, the way a car park looks permanent. Rock and urchins and cold. Nothing that belonged on a living reef, and no reason on earth to think it would ever come back. The man on the rocks that morning wasn't a fisherman. He'd spent years watching this coast go quiet and grey, and he'd landed on an idea almost nobody in the country believed, that you didn't need to fix a broken sea at all. You just had to stop taking from it and wait. And here's the strange part. Getting that ban signed, fighting the town, the boats, the officials that turned out to be the easy bit. What the sea did afterward, in that empty water, is the thing nobody could explain. And it didn't start where anyone was looking. It started down on the seabed. Keep your eye on the seabed as we go, because that is exactly where this whole thing began, in the one place nobody thought to look. I'm Peter, and this is the full story of how New Zealand's very first marine reserve came back from the dead. The one man who drew a line in the water, the animal that turned out to be the reef's real engineer, and the strange chain reaction nobody had planned for, nobody predicted, and this is the honest bit nobody has fully explained, even now. Because here's what most people get wrong about a place like this. They think the story is about a fish or a reef. It isn't. It's about a mechanism. The snapper and the spiny crayfish on that coast were never just seafood. They weren't residents of the reef visitors passing over it, something to catch and haul up. They were its builders, its engineers. They held the whole structure up, quietly, the way a keystone holds an arch. And nobody knew it, because you don't notice the keystone until you pull it out. So the fishermen pulled it out. For years they took the big things first, the old snapper, the heavy crayfish tucked in the crevices, and nobody grieved a single one of them. Why would you? It was dinner. But the morning the boats took the last big ones, the structure they'd been holding up began, very quietly, to fall. It fell because of one thumb-sized animal that suddenly had nothing left in the water to eat it. Here's exactly how it broke. So the last big snapper went over the side of a boat. The last spiny crayfish came up in a pot. And on the reef below, nobody was watching the one animal that mattered. The kina, a sea urchin the size of your thumb, all spines and appetite, gripping the rock in the dark. With its predators gone, it did the only thing it knew how to do. It bred, and it spread. Across the grey stone, in the thousands, then the tens of thousands, a slow crawling tide of spines moving over the reef, with nothing left in the water to stop it. And everywhere the urchins went, they grazed. They stripped the young kelp seedlings off the rock before a single frond could root and rise. The reef wasn't dying from the top down. It was being eaten out from the bottom up, one seedling at a time, until there was nothing green left to eat. Here's the part that genuinely unsettled the scientists, and it's the one mechanism most people have never once heard named. It has a name. It's called a trophic cascade. Follow the chain with me for a second, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Picture 3 floors. On the top floor, the predators, the snapper, and the crayfish. On the middle floor, the kina, and on the bottom floor, the kelp forest, and everything that lives inside it. Now, a trophic cascade means this. In plain terms, when you pull an animal off the top floor, you don't just leave an empty room up there. You knock the legs out from under everything below it. Remove the predators, and the kina explode. Let the kina explode, and the kelp is gone. Pull one thread at the top, and the whole thing unravels to the floor. That's what the snapper and the crayfish had really been doing all along. They were never just seafood. They were the reason there was a forest, and all the builders holding the whole structure up, quietly, for as long as anyone had been diving there. Take the builders out, and the building comes down. And it came down completely. What the urchins left behind, the scientists gave a name of its own, the kina barrens. Bare stone. Urchins wall to wall, packed shoulder to shoulder across the rock, like grey cobblestones, chewing at ground that had nothing left to give. No kelp, no small fish sheltering in it. No sponges, no color, no movement, but the slow grind of a million spines. A reef the size of a small farm, gone to desert. And to anyone who swam out over it, it didn't look damaged. It looked finished, permanently, hopelessly dead. For 20 years, that was the verdict. Dead rock. Not worth a hook, not worth a thought. Then, a marine scientist named Bill Ballantyne looked at that same grey desert and argued for something that sounded almost insulting in its simplicity. He didn't want to restock it. He didn't want to seed it, or plant it, or manage it, or lower a single kelp frond onto the rock by hand. His entire plan, for a reef everyone had written off, was 2 words long. Stop the boats. That was it. Draw the line, keep every net and pot and kina bag outside it, and then do nothing. Walk away, let it sit. And you have to understand how that landed. You've got a stretch of coast that has been bare stone for 2 decades, and the man's proposal is to remove the only human activity left and simply wait. No intervention, no rescue, just absence. To the fishermen, it was a waste of good water. To plenty of scientists, it sounded like giving up dressed as a plan. How does doing less fix a reef that's already dead? Every instinct says a broken thing needs mending. Ballantyne was betting it needed the opposite. It needed to be left alone. So, he got his line. In 1975, the boat stopped and everyone stood back and waited for the dead reef to answer. And for the first years, it answered with nothing at all. Season after season, the same bare grey stone, the same wall of urchins. Nothing. Nothing. Season after season, the same bare grey stone, the same wall of urchins, long enough that the doubters had every right to feel like prophets. And then, without a single fish being stocked, and not one urchin lifted off the rock, the snapper came back on their own. The crayfish followed, bigger and denser inside the line than anywhere on the fished coast outside it. And they began to eat. Look closely at the rock now, because this is the moment the whole thing turns. A big old snapper crunches through a kina like you or I would crack a walnut. A spiny crayfish, massed thick in a crevice, works one urchin loose from the stone, then another, then another. One urchin at a time. The balance, as the boats had broken, begins to tip back. It's slow, it's quiet, but across the reef, patches of bare rock start to open, where the urchins thin out small grey clearings in the grey desert. The first cracks in something that had looked permanent for 20 years. And in those clearings, a kelp seedling finally gets to live. That's all it ever needed. A gap, somewhere the urchins weren't. Where the keener thinned, the kelp came roaring back across the rock, dark fronds waving in the swell, then a canopy, then a forest. And a forest is not a decoration. It's an address. The small fish moved in first, then the sponges, then everything that eats the small fish and shelters in the sponges. The barren became a reef. Dead stone, in the space of a few years, turned into one of the richest stretches of living rock on the whole coast. The builders had come home, and they'd rebuilt the house. Then the scientists came to count. In 1998, a University of Auckland survey worked its way along the inside of the Cape Rodney Okakari Point Marine Reserve, divers with slates counting fish over the reef. Over 4 years, the same divers came back to the same stretches of coast, slate after slate, and the number they surfaced with is the one that ends the argument. Inside the line, snapper were more than 14 times denser than on the fished coast next door. Crayfish that had all but vanished from the open coast were massed thick behind the line. The dead rock wasn't just alive. It was measurably, verifiably richer than the sea that had been left open. 14 times. From nothing. I want to be honest about what this does not solve. The reserve is tiny 5 kilometers of coast in a very large ocean. Warming water still rolls in from outside, carrying disease that no line on a map can keep out. And the barrens haven't vanished everywhere. On plenty of unprotected coast, the grey desert is still exactly that. This isn't a spell. It's a demonstration. But something outlasted the argument. The Maori word for that reef, and the old abundance. It once held a word that had drifted almost out of use, while the coast lay barren, came back into everyday speech around Leigh. You name a thing again when it's worth naming, and a coastline that men had written off as bare rock is now the busiest snorkeling water in the entire country. School groups, families, kids pulling on masks and putting their faces in the water for the first time. They surface grinning. Most of them have no idea they're being taught the rarest lesson there is, what a full sea actually looks like. One man drew an invisible line in the water, and the ocean redrew the map. That's the whole of it. No hatcheries, no restocking, no clever management. A grey morning off Goat Island in 1975, a last fishing boat pulling away, and the simple, patient decision to stop and wait. The snapper and the crayfish did the rest because they were never guests on that reef. They were the ones who built it. If a coastline coming back from the dead is the kind of thing you didn't know still happened, tell me in the comments. And subscribe, because there are more of these comeback stories than you'd believe, quiet ones, all over the world, waiting to be told. Thanks for watching.